Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. I'm Yomika Bennett, Executive Director of the New York Charter School Association. Many of you have been joining our weekly webinars on Tuesday afternoons when we get policy updates from the authorizers and field your questions. In addition to those Tuesday webinars, we also have begun a host of subject-specific webinars on Thursday afternoons. We're planning a webinar in partnership with authorizers, ANET, TNTP, and TNTP during this time slot next week to discuss planning a return to school. And on April 30th, we will talk about student recruitment and enrollment in the current context. But for today, we want to give schools outside New York City the opportunity to address issues that are specific to operating in districts other than New York City DOE. We want to offer you the opportunity to address issues that are specific to your schools. So we're going to focus on two main topics today. First, we'll hear from Paul O'Neill, who is, among other things, the co-founder of the National Center for Special Education in Charter Schools. Paul is going to talk briefly about guidance and best practices for schools operating in district contexts where special education students aren't receiving services. Paul is also a lawyer who is very experienced on all matter of charter law and regulations and can field questions about other topics and issues you may be encountering with districts. Following that, I will share a brief update about school aid and the New York State budget, and open up to any questions that may be on your mind about budget or other topics. To submit questions, we'll field questions in the Q&A feature, which you can see at the bottom of your screen. As with prior webinars, we'll record this and make the recording and materials available on our website following the call. We also have David Frank and Susie Corello. If David's not here right now, he'll be joining shortly, as well as Ralph Rossi, and they'll help field questions at the end. Please note, if there are questions that are really specific to your school, we may offer to follow up offline. All right, thank you. Having said all that, Paul, welcome. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you very
much. I'm going to get started with our first question here, which is, many districts have been communicating that they're fully closed or were fully closed for a period of weeks at the end of March in particular. Most, if not all, of the charters on this call were not receiving any services for special education students during this time, and some still are not. What should schools be doing in this context?
All right. Well, Yumika, thank you very much. And as you mentioned, I'm speaking on behalf of the National Center for Special Education in Charter Schools. I am also an attorney representing schools in New York, but this is not legal advice. This is just me talking. So you raised the question of what happens if a district says that it's not providing any services and therefore not providing any special education services to the charter schools that are located there. Well, clearly this has been a very chaotic time. Districts are trying to do their best to assess what the right path forward is. No one's ever dealt with this before. And the federal government has helped a little bit on this. They've issued a few rounds of guidance about what to do about kids with disabilities in charter schools while the closures are going on. And one thing that they pointed out in the first of the guidance documents that they issued is that if a school, if a district, if an LEA is closed and does not endeavor to provide educational services during the closure, then special education services and those obligations don't kick in. But if they are providing services, if they do endeavor to serve all kids, or to serve the kids who are not special ed recipients, then they do have the obligation to go forward and provide services the way an LEA is supposed to do. Now in New York, we have this unusual arrangement where charter schools function as their own district, as their own LEA for everything except special education. And so you are not a standalone entity when it comes to special ed. You look to the district, you look to the CSE in order to receive services that you need, whether it's an IEP meeting or a manifestation determination review or an evaluation, whatever it may be. And it certainly puts things upside down if the district makes a determination that it is not providing services at all and falls into that first category that the U.S. Department of Education says that you could do. That leaves you in a circumstance where you're not primarily responsible for special ed, but you're still responsible for implementing special ed. And nobody saw this coming, right? I mean, this isn't something that everybody sat back and said, I'll bet that's going to happen sometime. It didn't. And so I think that we're doing the best we can. I would say this. There is also a question of whether changing around what the services are is a change in placement that would require an IEP team to meet to make that determination. So let's say your charter school shifts over to an all online program while you are not in the building. Do you have to get the CSE involved? Do you have to do that in order to serve those kids? And Dave, I see that David is on. David's organization, the State Ed Department, issued something, some guidance on the 27th of March, which took a position on this, which is that no, if you are providing online education to everybody, then a simple switch to online provision for kids with disabilities doesn't necessarily mean that the IEP team has to meet. It's that what you want to do is work with the parents, try to be very connected to the parents in an individualized way. But I would say, getting back to the initial question, which is what do you do if the district isn't doing anything, is I think there's a lot you could do to continue to work with those kids using the mechanisms that you have and trying to make sure that you, in as many cases as you can provide those services. But another thing that the U.S. Department of Education has made clear in its guidance is that not all services are going to be able to be provided during these remote educational service provision times. You may have to defer some of the services, some of the evaluations, anything that has to be done in person. You may have to defer that until we are back in normal mode and people come back into the buildings, and we would have to treat those as compensatory services. And that's the breakdown. I was just on another webinar like this for board members, and they asked about that, and I said, there's no magic line that I know of between the services that you can readily provide during the remote period and those that you might have to wait for. But you do need to take incredibly careful notes and record what it is you're doing so that you can explain it later on.
Thank you.
Can you say a little bit? Long answer. Sorry about
that. That's fine. If the school is providing services, can you say a little bit more about what documentation they should keep?
Yeah. So, I've got a bunch of authorizers here, and they can tell me if I'm wrong. But here's what I think. I think that in a total nutsy, cuckoo, crazy circumstance where nobody knows exactly what you have to do, the most important thing is that you use your good faith efforts to do what you think the right thing is. And you document that like crazy. In New York, we're expecting that people are going to have plans for what they're doing, not just for special ed, but for everything, right? So you're running it by your authorizer. You're trying to make sure that it's explicit, that everybody knows what you're doing. And if they have a problem with it, they can tell you. And that protects you on some level, because you're not just out there in the middle of nowhere with doing something on your own and finding out later that was a terrible, terrible, terrible idea. So I think that particularly with regard to kids with disabilities and services that may not be able to be provided right now, you have to be very explicit about what it is you're doing. So you're keeping records with your special ed folks, you're reporting that up through the food chain, up to the leadership, and then ultimately to the board so that everybody's on the same page. I think that the folks who are going to get in trouble at the end of the line here are the people who can't tell you what they did. And you don't want to be one of those schools.
All right, great. Sounds like great advice.
If I could just build upon that, Yumika.
Great, sure, please.
And we've told districts, and I would say this is the same for charter schools, that they might want to create a data collection system to outline why certain decisions were made about the provision of services to students with disabilities, why, if applicable, were timelines in IDEA exceeded, parent participation. So how are you getting parents to participate? And then I think one thing that's very important is to ensure that the CSE or the charter school are getting consent to provide those services through alternative methods.
Thank you, David.
No
before I move on to anybody else?
Yeah, hi, it's Ralph. I might just add a little to the micro side. So if the school that is providing services, or if the district, or in this case the district isn't, but if the school is providing its own related services, all the usual documentation of the number of times a week, how many minutes a day, what services were provided, And then the platform would be helpful to record, as well as the number of students being serviced at one time if that's different than a normal situation. So let's just say it's not a one-to-one, but for whatever reason, there's 3 students instead of 1, just record that. No one's saying you're going to get in trouble or not get in trouble over it. I think it does come down to a matter of, as Paul pointed out, what compensatory services may come out the other end. But it's best to have detailed records, which you also need to pay your vendors and things like that. And if there's slight changes from the IEP, let's just note that, and then we can flesh that out later. But to keep good records is very important.
All right, thank you, everyone. Paul, as we look ahead to reopening schools, what considerations should schools keep in mind about special education services or otherwise?
Well, when we think about reopening, I think the most important thing to think about as a threshold issue before we get to special ed is that, you know, this isn't a situation where you have an air raid and everybody goes down into bunkers and then when it's over, they come up and everything's over. You know, I think it's very unlikely that what we're talking about here is everything back to normal by some early date. It strikes me as likely that we're going to have some medium ground before, you know, everything is just the way it was before. And I think that schools need to prepare for that, and they need to think about it in a special education context. So when I say services that can't be provided in person during a remote period will be provided at the end of the line, and it'll be compensatory. But what is the end of the line? You know, is if it's not a simple reopening and everybody just goes back and tells all their stories about what they did when they were home, then I think there's a real question mark as to what starts when. There's already a question mark with reopening as to who's responsible for all that stuff. When we say that we're deferring services, what are we deferring? Is it the CSE? Is it the district that's providing? My understanding is that upstate, a lot of you folks are in districts where the district isn't providing very much to you right now on a special education front. So how's that going to work, right? How's it going to work when then there's even more than there was before, but you weren't getting anything before? I think keeping very careful track of what it is you've done and what it is you've deferred, because you may have to start making that argument to somebody else, like the U.S. Department of Education or David or Susie or, you know, Ralph. You have to know what happens or what's supposed to happen in terms of getting those services. Another consideration is that right now the U.S. Department of Education is gathering information about potential waivers to special education laws. When Congress passed the most recent Stimulus Act, it directed the secretary to take 30 days and figure out what waivers, if any, she needs on a bunch of different federal laws. That's up on about the 26th of April. So let's say the 27th of April, which is a Sunday, I think we should expect that there's going to be a request from the U.S. Department of Education for waivers, which could include and impact rules that soften that compensatory education phase. I think there are big city districts that are pushing pretty hard to not have to deal with this backlog, right? They're making the argument that that's going to break the bank. And so what you could see, and I'm not saying you're going to see it, but what you could see is a dispensation from Congress that says, we're not worried about the backlog. We're just going to start fresh. We're just going to pick up where we left off. And then you don't have to, if that happens, then you're not going to be worrying about, like, how do we find all these service providers that can provide all this mountain of stuff that wasn't happening for the last 2 or 3 or 4 or however many months, and who's going to pay for it, and how's it going to work out, and how can we possibly give somebody 200 hours or something that normally gets 5 a week. So it's difficult for me to say with clarity how exactly it's going to look, but I think everybody's got to pay attention to those questions and keep good record.
Okay. Thank you very much. David, Susie, Ralph, do you want to add anything to that? Okay, great. All right, so we'll move on to the next question. With all the recent news about schools moving away from Zoom as a platform for online learning, what advice do you have, Paul, for schools that are still either using Zoom or considering moving to a new platform? And then are there any considerations you would encourage schools to use when evaluating whatever platform to use with students?
Right. Well, this is another area where we've seen some flexibility from Washington. As everybody I'm sure knows by now, there are restrictions for privacy on what platforms you can use to provide therapy services, teletherapy services. And the HIPAA law in particular protects the privacy of student information by saying you can only use platforms that are approved under HIPAA. But that's not very easy for schools to work with when they had no warning and they're using other platforms. And so the HHS folks in Washington have allowed some flexibility. And so you can use things like Zoom and other platforms that weren't really built for that kind of thing. That has resulted in a lot of schools incorporating that into their special education services. But you probably know that there are people have developed something called Zoom bombing, where you jump in on somebody else's Zoom, and sometimes it's funny and sometimes it's not very funny as to what you're seeing on a screen, which has led at least the New York City district to say, yeah, you're not using that anymore. Now, I don't know enough about the upstate districts and whether other folks have followed suit, but that has resulted in a question about whether charter schools can continue to use Zoom as a way to provide teletherapy. My understanding is, and I have not seen this written down on paper, but I have been told numerous times that the New York City district is being flexible about that if charter schools want to continue to use that as their platform. But one tricky thing for anybody in that circumstance is that it's the providers, the people who are providing the therapies, who also have to be willing to use Zoom. And I think with New York City, they're kind of saying, well, we're not good with that. And so you might have fewer people that you can look to provide services. Again, that's a New York City thing, not necessarily saying it's impacting any folks on this call, but you do have to give some thought to what we're giving up. If we're going to use a non-secure platform, what are we giving up in terms of privacy for kids and for the process? And do what you can to try and minimize that. My understanding in talking to some of the networks who've used Zoom is that you can do a private version of Zoom that has many more protections on the security side than the public version does. And you can put in other kinds of protections. So I don't think it's so much what the platform is as are you paying enough attention to whether there's actually security.
All right. Very good. Thank you. Many schools are particularly concerned with district payments. Moving on to our next hot topic issue here. Do you have any guidance for what schools can be doing now and what they should do if they receive a payment from a district that is not aligned with the invoice they submitted?
I will try, but I think the other people on this call are better equipped to answer that question. I would say, in general, when you're not getting the money that you think you're supposed to get, there's a process called the intercept process that gets utilized by charter schools and others. You would file for an intercept to the state and then say, look, we didn't get what we're supposed to get. And that's not a process that I can run. I guess that's more of a David thing.
Well, thank you, Paul.
Tag, you're it.
So we do have intercept guidance on our website, and certainly that's your right as a charter school if you're not paid the funding that you think you're paid. However, the very first step in our intercept process, and many of you have already worked with Valerie Kowalski, who works in my office regarding this, is to work with your district. There might be a reason that you were paid less than you anticipated. We know that this is occurring right now with some schools in Buffalo, but we strongly encourage you to talk to the district. In our conversations with them, they have been reasonable, and I know that there's historical reluctance to reach out to them, but we would encourage you to do so. We haven't heard of any districts, again, other than the situation in Buffalo, where the district is responding to a requirement by the state comptroller, but we haven't heard of any districts withholding funding or paying charters less than they're statutorily obligated to provide. And if there are specific concerns, like I said, reach out to the district, see what they have to say.
Okay, Ralph, you want to add something?
Yeah, I might just add, and again, this isn't legal advice, and I'll disclaim any fiscal advice here as well, but there there are two other things you can do. You don't have to go the intercept route, which is, of course, in essence, free, though you have to do a lot of work internally. You could also retain counsel and sue the district. Or if it turns out at this point in the year where you should be owing the district money in the reconciliation, well, maybe you would withhold that money and enter into a negotiation with the district and say, what are we going to do about this? So, that could be a situation as well to think about when you get there. We're hoping that we won't have to get there, but we don't know what any district might do on any given day with any given bill.
I would just emphasize, we urge you to reach out to districts and have conversations with them. We have seen that there's flexibility on part of districts, and hopefully they're willing to work with you. Of course, there are situations where that doesn't happen. We just finished up 2 lawsuits between a charter school and a district here in the capital region, and unfortunately had to go to court. But we do encourage you to have those conversations.
If I could just insert myself as the godmother of that lawsuit.
Thanks, Anna.
Yeah, anytime. I think that I would just touch on a theme that something that Paul was saying earlier, and a theme that's come through in prior webinars, which is the very first step is make sure that your own documentation is in order. And so that you can, because if you reach out to the district to understand what the discrepancy is, you need to make sure that you can really vouch for the fact that all of those students are still legitimately enrolled in your school. And I think to Ralph's point, where folks have had questions and concerns, and the future seems, through a glass darkly, are questions around things like special education reimbursement rates for things like co-teaching and ICT rates, those sorts of things, but really making sure that you can substantiate the amount that you submitted in your invoice, and any communication that you've had either with the district or on any other topic related to the amount that you expect, because you're going to need that as a first step, whether you go down the road of an intercept or of legal action. And so just making sure that you really can put all of those pieces of paper all together, electronically. They're probably not really pieces of paper, but all together in a bow, it is something you'll have to do under any circumstances.
And the intercept process is not fast, and it's not a guarantee that you'll get the funding that the charter school feels that it's owed. The burden of proof really is on the charter school. And so I would emphasize what you said about documentation, sort of garbage in, garbage out. And we've seen that a lot with some of these cases.
Thank you, everyone. So now we would typically turn it over to Q&A, but I don't see that we have any outstanding questions there. I think David.
Well, there is one that Kirsten asked that I actually think is worth, that David answered. And David, I agree with your answer, but I think is worth probing on for this group in particular, and in the current context. So for folks who didn't see it, Kirsten's question is about what concerns should charters have about being liable for either providing or paying for compensatory services? And David's response, which is 100% accurate, is that if a service is enumerated in a student's IEP, then the school district is required to either provide the service or reimburse the charter for paying for the service, for providing the service. I think the question that raises for me, and is one that has been raised to us previously that I would love to get this group to weigh in on, is if a school was previously providing related services in particular through a contracted provider, should they continue to be providing that? And then should they, if they have historically, rightly or wrongly, footed the cost of those services, do they continue to incur those costs because they have historically been the service, maybe not the direct service provider, but the sort of they have undertaken the contract. for the service provider. And then for schools outside of Buffalo, if anyone was wondering what district I was talking about, for schools outside of Buffalo, if a district is not currently providing related services, should charters consider contracting for remote related services, incurring a cost with an expectation to have the district support that cost? Any thought?
I'll toss in and others can add to it. To the extent that there are districts that are not meeting their legal obligations here, we're not going to solve that during the COVID crisis, I don't think. And we always have to look to the IEP. Does the IEP say you're supposed to be getting related services? And if it does, you saying, well, that's kind of hard for us, we really don't want to do that right now. It brings us to that question of, are these services that should be deferred till the end of this to compensatory services or not? If they're not, I think the district is I think the charter school is taking something of a risk to say, we're simply just discontinuing it because it's gotten expensive for us. But you're not supposed to have been bearing that burden in the first place, so it is murky. I think that you need to make an individualized decision about this. You need to keep all kinds of records. You have to make a decision about whether it's something that we be put towards the end of the process. But I would just be careful about following student IEPs or going through a process to change the IEP, which is hard, as we talked about before. Hard to do that remotely. But I wouldn't, I'd think about it twice before I did a big change.
I might just add to that, there's flexibility in the Charter Schools Act. I don't know if it's 2853-4, pretty sure it's not 2854-4, where a charter can always ask the district to provide services. But the way you pose the question and what's going on right now, a charter can't act in a vacuum. It's part of that LEA for this purpose. It has to communicate with the LEA. So let's just say, Upstate Charter School X was providing speech, and all of a sudden decides it doesn't want us to provide speech. Well, you better let the CSE, even if that CSE is not providing anything, I think you better have a record of communicating with the CSE and saying, hey, CSE, we're thinking of terminating our speech services, and we'd like you to provide the services, and get some conversation on it, rather than take a unilateral action that, as Paul said, could have consequences later when it comes to compensatory services or otherwise. When we think about for a student standpoint, I would hope the charter schools would want to continue their services and settings, even if the compensatory services are forgiven later by the federal government, which is one prospect. And I think there's also flexibility when it comes to compensatory services, and we're not there yet, in viewing it in the way that just because the charter school was able to get certain providers during a certain time frame to provide services, it doesn't mean it's in the best position or able to provide those services on a compensatory level. As Paul said, if you now need something 5 days a week instead of 3, and they only have the capacity to provide 3 because of their schedule, their student load, or the contractor's load, then that's an issue that maybe has to be turned back with communication to the CSE and say, we're going to ask you to provide these compensatory services. Ultimately, I think the way it's arranged, because the LEA is on the hook, the LEA would have to provide them or get out of providing them more so than the charter school. But I think there might be different views if I was the district.
That was a question that I wanted to ask in follow-up to something that Paul said around compensatory services, which I had not heard before, that implied any sort of theory that those compensatory services, the sort of finish line, if you will, for thinking about when they might have to be completed by, is not June 30th, which is the end of the fiscal year for charter schools and for districts. Do you think, Paul, for that to happen, would there need to be a waiver? Would that be part of some of the federal act or something coming out of SED to sort of change that finish line?
I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. You're saying that the assumption was that the finish line when compensatory services might be due would be the end of the fiscal year as opposed to, yeah, I don't think that's what we're talking about here. I think we're talking about, I think this is all the product of people trying to figure out what do we do in the real world to deal with the situation we're actually in. And it's just physically not possible to get people together and do some of this stuff. So what can we do? Well, we can wait till it's over. Now, remember, I think I'm right when I say figuring out what the finish line is going to be harder than I think some folks may think it's going to be. And by the way, it may not be permanent. It could be that we're going to come back on some provisional basis and then there's a spike and everybody goes out again for a while and it's back and forth. I mean, there's so many ways this could play out. But I think schools have to be aware of that, be keeping incredibly careful track of what they're doing, communicating with the CSE as much as you can about all of this, harder if there's not a great relationship there. And just be flexible and pay attention to the developments. Like I said, you're gonna learn a lot at the beginning of next month when Congress does something. And it's really hard to answer this question until Congress acts.
That was, Paul, a really helpful observation that you made to me in a conversation that we had a couple of weeks ago. And so one of the things that we had already been discussing was planning to update on some of this topic either at the end of the week in 2 weeks or the week after, once we know more about what that guidance will be and what implications that has once it has passed through the hallowed halls of SED. So I think that has answered the questions that we've received and the questions that we were aware existed out there in the world prior to this. So, Yomika, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Anna. So what I want to talk about is just update on answer some questions and give an update on the charter school funding formula particularly. So as you all know, the state budget that was passed earlier this month included a change in the charter school funding formula. So the formula for 2021 now includes a 5.5% reduction. The reduction is due to the hit that the state revenues are going to take or are taking caused by the current coronavirus crisis. It's important to note that the 5.5% is not a cut from last year's aid level, right? The formula will still look at the annual operating expenses and growth factors to calculate a basic tuition amount, and the 5.5% decrease is then applied to that number. To put it in a little bit simpler terms, calculate next year's tuition as if the formula did not change and decrease that by 5.5%. The intent by the state was to keep education aid flat across the board. They chose apparently New York City's rate of increase, which is the biggest district in the state, obviously. Unfortunately, of course, districts had different rates of increase from year to year, so the 5.5% reduction in the formula impacts schools differently. The state does expect to use federal aid to fill the gaps and keep funding for everyone at the current year's level. So that's a key point. We're looking to that federal aid to bring everyone up to the current year's level, so that you don't see any decrease from year to year. It's also important to note that district school aid is similarly effective. State aid to districts will be adjusted by what is called a pandemic adjustment amount. And that information and that language is included in the budget, including the appropriation with state aid. Federal aid from the CARES Act will be used to bring the total aid to districts up to this year's level. So again, the intent of the state was to keep education aid flat. There is a provision in the budget, I should note, that allows the division of the budget to review and adjust funding, not just the schools, but across all areas of the budget. There are a few exceptions for lawsuits or whatever, but basically what that means is that the state will come back this year, look at how much money is in the bank, so to speak, and make adjustments accordingly if there's not enough funding available to make payments across the state. So schools, localities, other areas are affected as well. And essentially the state will make these revenue reviews 3 times a year to determine if there's enough money to make the payments. Those review periods are from April 1st to April 31st, May 1st to June 30th, and July 1st to December 31st. If there's insufficient revenue to cover the payments, as I said, then DOV will make a recommendation on how to reduce those payments so that checks don't bounce. The legislature then has 10 days to approve their recommendation or come up with its own plan. This is the language in the budget that allows DOB to make, again, those across-the-board reductions. And it's in the budget. It's in the budget bill, the entire, right, the large bill. But it does not seem to specifically affect the charter school formula. So the formula is in one part of the budget, which is part of state law. The provision regarding the DOB's ability to make the adjustments is not captured directly in that charter formula. Charter formula language. So at its outset, like I said, it doesn't seem to specifically affect the formula. That's not to say that any school district that gets its school aid cut will not withhold an equivalent amount in tuition payments to charter schools. So I wanted to make sure you make that clear. If you look at the formula, if you open up to or there are no more books, right? So if you go online and find the charter formula and law, you'll see the language of the formula. You see the language separately in a different section of law regarding DOB's authority to make the reduction for this year because of the pandemic, essentially. And there's nothing that says that one directly affects the other. But I want to, again, reiterate, if the school district that receives a cut in its aid as a result of DOB's actions, there's nothing to say that the districts would not then withhold an equivalent amount. We will follow that closely as possible and keep you updated on any actions. What I want to close with, and the most important point I want to make here too, is to consider the possibility of actions, and also look for the updates. And what will be important here is that federal aid or any revival of the state's economy that brings more revenue back to the state. So the more revenues start to come in, tax revenues come in, et cetera, et cetera. Another COVID-4, which Congress is currently debating. Those additional funds come in, more money comes into the state coffers. That means that will help DOB avoid making any reductions at all. So that was my 5-minute charter school funding piece.
Yomika, can I add one thing just based on a question that John and I discussed about an hour ago?
Sure.
So folks may be aware that there is a provision from the CARES funding that that charter schools will receive directly, although they will receive them through SED. And the question has been asked, how much money can they expect? And so what I just want to explain, it's my understanding, but certainly David, you should correct me if I'm wrong, is that total pot of money is being divided by the 50 states on a basis of their Title I share. So the proportion so that full pot of money is being sliced up relative to how many Title I students are in that state as a proportion of the total Title I population in the country. And so then each state gets an allocation, and the states are allocating that money to LEAs, which in New York means either a charter school or a district, based on their proportion of Title I students in the state. And so what that means is that your charter schools are getting a slice of a slice. And so it is not that the Title I formula is being, or the Title I dollar amount or whatever that is being applied to your relative enrollment. So what this means is that new, small, or growing schools will get very little or no funds from this source of funding. And we've received a lot of questions about that, and I hate to be the one to give that answer, but now is also not the time for false hope. If I can channel some of Governor Cuomo's Joe Friday, just the facts moments. So there is discussion about future other pots of money, and that may at some future point charters may have access to, and we may have the ability to address this issue, because this issue is not specific to New York, and even nationally. This has been brought up in a lot of different places. There are charter schools in other states that apparently are less likely to participate in the title program than charter schools in New York, where I think it is much more common that schools are participating or have participated, and those schools are also receiving none of this funding. And so it's not unique to schools in these circumstances in New York, but it is something that has been coming up, and wanted to make sure that folks were aware. But David, do you have anything to add, or want to give any additional context about timing or other things that schools can or should expect in relative to this funding?
Yeah, so the CARES Act funds are going to be awarded based on your share of your 1920 Title I Part A funds. So if you're a new school, we're not looking at 1819. So you will get, how much that'll be, I can't say definitively, but the relevant statute is it's section 18003 and of the CARES Act, and SED is working on a methodology. We're working closely with the governor's office. I don't have any more specifics as to timing or specific dollar amounts that schools will get. Everyone has submitted a consolidated Title I application. We checked on that, and I'll share information as soon as we have it.
Thank you. Sorry, Yomika, thanks for letting me interject.
That's okay. I just wanted to, and now I'm going to ask David a question. I apologize, David. For the CARES Act funding, I want to be clear, right, and correct me if I'm wrong, yesterday, U.S. Department of Education announced that the governor's portion of the CARES Act funding that will come to the state has the application process is open, states can apply. But the larger part, the $1.1 billion for K-12, which is where the Title I sort of overlay applies, has not been released yet. Am I right about that?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay.
New York does plan to apply for the $3 billion that they announced yesterday, but that money not only is shared amongst the applicants, which we assume are all 50 states, but it's for K through 12 as well as higher education.
Okay, and I think New York's pegged for $164 million of that, so that's the smaller part of the two. We're looking for the $1.1 billion.
Yeah. And then
okay,
we're also looking for other funding. So we're looking for permission from the US DOE to help reallocate some of our CSP, our charter school program funds, to support the transition from brick and mortar to remote instruction. We haven't heard yet, but we're cautiously optimistic about it.
Okay. Very good. Does anyone have anything else to add before? I think we've covered all the topics. If anyone on the call who's on the webinar, if you have any questions, always feel free to reach out to us. So you can email us, visit our website. Keep thinking, keep asking questions. We hope that this was helpful to you. Thank you, everyone, who are panelists who were here to answer questions today. Thank you for everybody who's on the call taking their time to listen in. And we will see you Tuesday. Thank you. Have a great weekend.